And welcome everybody to our session today. I'm going to go ahead and just dive right into the presentation. So Regulation 408B2, which most plan sponsors are well aware of at this point, made the disclosure of income received from your 401k plan and fiduciary status for those services provided to your 401k plan mandatory for anyone involved in providing services to your 401k. The focus since the release of 408B2 for most plan sponsors has been on reviewing the fees paid by your 401k plan to ensure that all those fees are actually reasonable for the services that you receive. If you haven't benchmarked your fees to the current market in a blind RFI, meaning that your identity isn't put out there or disclosed to the vendors that you're polling for pricing, you definitely should. What you'll find is the initial request for information during an audit from the DOL, they'll ask questions like, did you receive your 408B2 disclosure statement from all of your vendors? And they'll ask you, what have you done to justify that the fees being paid by the 401k are competitive for the value that you're receiving? They'll also tell you to send them documentation with respect to how the decisions are made within your retirement plan. We think it's really important to focus on the value you're receiving and the documentation of how decisions are made. So in this presentation, I'm going to take a deeper dive into some of the finer points of the legal agreements, practice standards, and the documentation of reviews, also known as the minutes for your plan. There's a great deal of content on these slides, probably a little bit more words than is typical for our presentations, but we want to make sure that you leave this session with tangible materials that can help you in the management of your retirement plan. So the first step in any professional relationship is obviously the legal agreements. Once you decide that you're going to sign up an investment advisor or an outside provider of any kind, you're going to need to get those legal agreements in place. These agreements are the foundation document for how the relationship will work and who is going to be responsible for things in the end. It should indicate an acknowledgement of fiduciary status. It should establish limits of liability and a basis for action. We're going to take a closer look at each of these three different items and what you need to look for in this foundation document of the agreement. So the first is the acknowledgement of responsibility. Fiduciary status has become an increasingly hot topic over the last several years. Anyone within your organization who has the ability to exercise control over the plan is considered a fiduciary. And that's an important distinction. It's just that you have to have the ability to exercise control over the plan. You don't actually have to exercise that control, just have the ability to do so. The same does not apply to your outside vendors. Your advisor can decide which services they want to provide and subsequently if they're going to be deemed a fiduciary or not. With the implementation of 408B2, it's now required for that fiduciary status to be disclosed by your investment advisor. So read these disclosure statements carefully. There's a lot of different types of fiduciaries, and the wordplay can give you the impression that you have someone sharing in the fiduciary responsibility, when in fact that might not be the case. So with respect to the various types of fiduciaries, the most common are the 338 and 321. A 338 fiduciary means that that advisor has full discretion over plan investments, and they can actually make changes to the fund offerings for your plan without consulting with you as the plan sponsor. This is in contrast to the 321 fiduciary, who gives advice to the plan sponsor but doesn't have discretion to change the plan investments. In a 321 environment, the decision is ultimately up to you as a plan sponsor as to whether you take the advice from your advisor or not. So 321 means that there's no discretion. They have to ask you as a plan sponsor for changes. 338, full discretion, means that that advisor can make changes without asking you first. So historically, a great deal of discussion centered on the differences between the two types of investment advisor fiduciaries. We're definitely seeing the lines blur with respect to responsibility or liability in our industry. If an investment advisor declares they have a fiduciary responsibility, the nuances of services and how the services are delivered are becoming less important. Even if an advisor declares they are not a fiduciary, yet provides investment advice with respect to plan assets, they can still be deemed a fiduciary simply by their actions. So given these changes in the landscape, the Advisory Services Agreement has heightened importance with respect to defining the standards of judgment and who's going to be responsible for the various pieces of the plan. So now, in connection to fiduciary status and services provided, which we'll talk about next, There are very specific terms that you want to see in your agreements and terms that you want to avoid in your agreements. And what it comes down to is who is going to have responsibility and how far are you going to have to go in order to prove that there was actually a breach of the agreement, or how far are you going to have to go to prove that it's now time for your outside partner or vendor to step in and take responsibility. And so it starts with this statement of accepts responsibility for damages to client as a direct result of our, and then what you want to avoid and what you would like to see. This is just saying that what needs to happen to the plan or to you as a plan sponsor in order for your advisor to start taking responsibility. You want to avoid terms like gross negligence. Gross negligence means that you have to go all the way to the degree of proving that they were completely and grossly negligent. If you look on the want side, a few down, you'll see negligence, which doesn't have the gross in front. That's simple negligence. That's a much easier term for you to be able to reach rather than going to the degree of having to prove that the advisor was all the way grossly negligent before they would be able to take responsibility. Willful malfeasance is something that you want to avoid, and that's in contrast to, on the right side, willful misfeasance. The term to avoid malfeasance means that this person meant to harm you, that they were willfully out there to do wrong for you as a plan sponsor. Willful misfeasance, the term that you would want to see, simply means that we intended to do the right thing, but it just didn't go our way. And the reason that you'd rather have misfeasance than malfeasance, if it's malfeasance and you have to actually prove that they intended to do you harm before it kicks in, again, that's a much higher bar, a much higher standard to reach, and doesn't provide nearly as much protection for you as a plan sponsor. Noncompliance with 404C is something you want to avoid because that's really not a very high bar to meet. 404C, as it applies to retirement plan investments, simply says you have to have a few investments, cash, equities, fixed income, a very, very low bar, and if they meet those requirements, then they would have hit 404C. And so not having compliance with 404C isn't really a very high bar in order to be able to show breach and that they would in fact be responsible. Now on the want side, there's a few other terms that you would want to see. Bad faith, obviously if they're not acting in good faith towards you as a plan sponsor, you would want them to take responsibility. A breach of fiduciary duty, if they have a duty to your plan as a fiduciary, they breach that duty, you would like them to obviously step in and provide remedy. And then a breach of any material term of the agreement, which is a fairly standard term that most agreements should include. So next, we've talked about fiduciary status and some of the terms you want to see and avoid, but now let's talk about what's included. Every agreement will include, in one format or another, a list of services to be provided. This is absolutely critical to your risk management procedures because if you don't see something on the list, it means two things. Number one, it's not included in the price, but number two, and more importantly, it's not included in the protection provided by your partner. You want to see specific items of importance and broad terms that have supporting documents. As it applies to plan investments, the investment policy statement, or IPS, and quarterly report are very broad terms, but ones that will have very specific supporting illustrations. You want to ensure that there's documentation of all recommendations, an acceptance of the responsibility for those recommendations or actions, and a commitment to review and update all the processes at least annually. So this is, on the next slide, going to be just an example of having the recommendations from your investment advisor in writing. It's critical that you receive written recommendations from your advisor. Again, this shows an example of what you should expect for documentation. It shows an investment option on the watch list, why it was placed on the watch list, specific opinion as to what happened, what are the issues for the fund, and most importantly, a specific recommendation on how you as the client should proceed. These types of specific documentation should be included in the services provided on an ongoing basis. If there's not something in writing that your advisor recommended something to you, then in fact it didn't happen, and it'd be very hard to prove that you were taking the advice of your advisor if you're not getting it in writing. Excuse me. The next section here, it's just further documentation. On the previous one, the fund in question was recommended for removal. In conjunction with that documentation where you get it in writing that it's being recommended for removal, it's important to document the process for selecting a replacement option. While there's a lot of numbers on this slide, the specific numbers aren't important here. This type of illustration shows the fund to be removed in a side-by-side comparison to 2 or 3 options presented to this client as recommended replacement options. It is intended to be a detailed, although fairly easy to follow with instruction, illustration of the factors considered when the client makes their decision. Again, we show you this as an example of the types of services your agreement should point to and the type of responsibility your providers should be taking for the services they provide. If your advisor recommends a fund needs to be removed, and in fact then you do remove it and you replace it with another investment option, you need to be able to prove and show why did you pick the option that you did as the replacement. In case you're ever challenged down the road, having that documentation to pull out and say, this is what we considered, here are the options that were looked at, and here's why we came to the decision that we did. So as important as what your provider will be responsible for is what they are going to expect of you. Many agreements should and will dictate exactly what is expected of you as the client. The most common items will be active participation and continuous due diligence. Active participation simply means that you need to stay involved. If your provider is trying to communicate with you, you need to be responsive to them within a reasonable amount of time. If there are actions recommended, you need to dictate how you intend to proceed. Continuous due diligence refers to your requirement to evaluate on an ongoing basis if your provider continues to meet both the expectations outlined in the agreements and the general expectations of a similar provider in the marketplace. For example, is your investment advisor providing you with a high level of service for a reasonable price as dictated by current market conditions? Or do you have the documentation to prove you've completed your due diligence? So ongoing due diligence is important for advisors, for your record keepers, and to be able to say, yes, we've looked, we are getting a good service, and we're getting a good service at a reasonable price. So we referred earlier to core pieces of an agreement, and limitations to liability is a big one. All agreements will, by their very nature, have some degree of limitation as to what liability they will accept. So reasonable limits or exclusions are those items that are really out of your advisor or provider's control. Individual participant direction, investment options that you as the client have directed to be included in the plan against your advice of your provider, company stock, self-directed brokerage accounts, any action related to plan administration and the custody of assets. So plan administration would refer to your sending in information on time, submitting payroll files, enrolling new hires, and so forth, whereas custody of assets will be a very specific function to your custodian, which is typically a separate agreement in and of itself. But all of these things are reasonable limitations to liability, and you want to make sure that if there are things beyond some of these reasonable limitations, that you evaluate them and find whether or not they're going to be acceptable for your organization. So, acceptance of liability for investment decisions. With this slide, we'll move a little bit away from the agreement and into practice standards. Now, much of this section will relate to the agreement, and some of it, in fact, will even be included in your agreement, but we're going to present it in the framework of what you want to see in the day-to-day interaction with your plan advisor. On the previous slide, we discussed the idea of what reasonable limits are to liability. Here, we're going to discuss the acceptance of liability for investment decisions and what that really looks like in practice. The fine points you see on the slide all point to the idea of having the responsibility for accepting recommendations made by your advisor remain with your advisor. If they recommend something to you and you as a plan sponsor accept the recommendation from your advisor, then your advisor should stand behind that. What this looks like is a hold harmless for all involved with your organization. Plan sponsor, officers, directors, committee members, anyone who has that ability to exercise control over the plan, those internal fiduciaries charged with the actual operation and decision-making for the plan, they should have a hold harmless. If you've hired this outside prudent expert to take some of the burden of being a prudent expert off of you as a plan sponsor, well then you're taking the advice of your prudent expert, and as long as you're performing that ongoing due diligence, then they should be willing to hold you harmless for the services that they're providing. That hold harmless should include all resulting damages, settlements, and defense costs for the services that they're providing. So your advisor should be willing to step in from the very beginning and defend the recommendations that result in your action, not stand aside while you gather counsel and decide how to defend your actions. You want an advisor that is going to go out from the beginning, step in front of you and say, no, we're holding our plan sponsor harmless. We're going to defend our plan sponsor. The reason that we do this in our practice is simply because we found that a lot of plan sponsors don't have ERISA counsel ready and at hand, and we don't want the plan sponsor to have to go out and try and find an attorney that maybe has some experience in ERISA but not experienced there, but rather to say, no, if you're the advisor, step out in front, get in front of your plan sponsor, and make sure that they have the right representation. They have someone who is specifically skilled in the art of ERISA. And most importantly, and this really should go without saying, but you should never be asked to waive the rights afforded to you under ERISA. Now, while ERISA sets the groundwork for how to run a plan and it can get you in trouble, it also has the same ability to protect you as you run your plan. Examples of waiving your rights afforded you under ERISA would include the requirement to arbitrate or mediate claims with your partner. Now, based on the facts and circumstances of whatever might come up, you may decide that it's the best course of action to do arbitration, but don't agree to that course of action before you know the nature of the problem. Most challenges come in the form of litigation filed by participants. You don't want to be in the position of facing litigation on one front and be limited to arbitration when dealing with the vendor that may have contributed to the problem. You should certainly be cautious of agreements that state that you're limited to FINRA arbitration, because FINRA is the self-regulatory arm of the securities industry. Their focus and expertise is not on matters driven by ERISA. So by this point, I'm sure that all plan sponsors have been thoroughly saturated with the term 408b2. On the retirement side, this is one of the most significant pieces of legislation that's come along in a while. And I'm not going to cover it in great detail here, as the implementation of 408b2 is now a little over 2 years old. All plan sponsors should have already received and distributed notices describing the fees linked directly to their plan. Now, with that said, there's one question that should have been asked, but is often overlooked. Do you receive any compensation not paid directly from the plan by any vendor? And it's not too late to ask that question. The answer gets to the heart of what your vendors and advisors are making from your plan, and if they have any underlying incentives for recommendations they make. The genesis of this is just to ensure that everything is fully and 100% disclosed, because a lot of times there can be a difference between what are we disclosing, what are you paying, versus what in fact is that provider making for the services that they provide. This next slide will start to show a case study of a client of ours that we did a blind benchmarking study against a couple of providers, 3 different providers, and it'll show you side by side to say the current provider and how their pricing structure worked, and then providers 1, 2, and 3. It has been historically very common in the industry for current providers to say, we don't charge you anything. We have lots of plan sponsors we've gone to say that have said, no, we don't pay anything for the administration of our plan. And I think at this point, most plan sponsors realize that the plan isn't actually free. It's just a matter of where does the compensation come from for your vendors. Now, all vendors should be compensated for the services they provide to your retirement plan, but it's a matter of understanding where does that compensation come from and who gets paid what. What you'll see on this slide here, and I'll use the green arrow to show, is that for their current provider, they had no gross annual fee, so they were not paying anything out of pocket or being charged anything for the plan sponsor. They did not have any revenue sharing that was being used to offset any explicit fee. Their net annual fee down here was 0. Again, they weren't paying anything out of pocket. They weren't paying anything directly from plan assets. And so the total expense of the plan really came down to this, the 0.56, just the mutual fund expense. And that's the weighted expense of the investment options according to how participants have allocated among the different investments. And so you come all the way down here to the bottom and you'll see it's just 0.56 for their current provider. Now, provider 1 and provider 2, you can see are a little bit different. Up here, provider 1 charges $117,000 for this plan sponsor's administration. Provider 2 charges $140,000. Provider 3 is similar to their current provider in that there's no explicit charge. But so focusing on providers 1 and 2, they have an explicit charge, then they have the revenue sharing that comes back from the mutual funds that results in a net annual fee that's charged against the mutual fund expense. And when you add it all together, you come down here and you get a total annual fee, including mutual fund expense. It's a different way of illustrating the fees. And you come down to the bottom and you can see how the fees compare. 0.56 for the current provider, 0.59 for provider 1, 0.57 for 2, and 0.62 for provider 3. Now, the initial reason for doing this search for this client was to say, are we paying an appropriate fee? Let's just do some benchmarking. And based on this first slide, I think it would be very easy for the plan sponsor to stop here and say, well, according to this survey, we're actually with the lowest cost provider. So we're doing well, we're happy with our service, and so let's just move on. And our argument to that, or to dig a little bit deeper, would be to say, again, not just what are you paying, but what is your provider, in fact, making for the services provided to your plan. So on the next slide here, and this is a result of the 408B2 notice and requirements that came from, again, 408B2, was to say exactly what is coming from your plan. What is your provider making for the services that they're providing? And so you'll see here now the estimated revenue sharing as disclosed through 408B2 is $173,000. And now previous to 408B2, that never would have been disclosed. It wasn't required. But now for the current provider, they looked at their 408B2 notice and said, okay, $173,000 is what our provider is making for the services that they're providing us. And you come over and you compare that to then the total fee earned by the provider against providers 1 and 2 and 3 here, and you'll see that they're earning $172 with their current provider. Provider 1 is $117,000, $140,000 for provider 2, and then a little higher at provider 3 at $185,000. And so what this client did is they went back to their current provider and said, you don't have to come all the way down to $117,000 to the low-cost provider, but it looks to us, based on the survey that we did, that in fact our fees are not necessarily in line with current market pricing. And while they still might pay the same amount in terms of the client's fees might not actually go down in terms of what they're paying, that 0.56 on the previous slide, but they can negotiate the revenue sharing fee down, so then they can use a portion of that for other things associated with the plan. In this case, the current provider, they were able to negotiate $30,000 in fee concessions, and they used that $30,000 then to go out and help pay for audit fees or outside advisor fees. And in fact, then still paying the same amount, we're able to reduce overall costs associated with the plan. So this comes to the next question of fee neutrality. With the increasing focus on fees comes an increasing focus on investment revenue sharing. Those numbers that I was showing and the focus on fees and what's being disclosed through 408B2. And it's produced the idea of fee neutrality and the important question of, do you know which plan investments are offsetting plan fees? Said another way, which funds give money back to the plan and which don't? What are the levels? Who is invested in those investments? And to use an off-putting term, and I've heard this from a lot of plan sponsors over the years, but which funds are subsidizing the cost of the entire plan? And what you'll see here on this slide is this is an example of a client we recently reviewed. This information was given to us by the provider. As you can see here, there are 30 different investment options, but only the ones highlighted in yellow actually pay any revenue sharing back to the plan. So out of 30 different investment options, only 10 of those 30 actually pay any money back to the plan sponsor. So the answer to our question, do you know which plan investments are offsetting plan fees? In this case, 42% of plan assets were invested in those 10 funds. 42% of plan assets are offsetting 100% of plan fees. So said in reverse, 58% of this plan's assets generate no revenue sharing to reduce plan fees whatsoever. So 58% of the plan assets are being subsidized by the folks that are in the investments that actually do generate revenue sharing. Now, there's a few ways this issue can be remedied. There are some providers who have the technology in place to ensure that revenue sharing generated from plan investments are given back to those participants who invested there and generated the revenue. It kind of levels the playing field. Another way is to investigate the ability to change investment share classes to reduce or eliminate revenue sharing. In most cases, it's tough to completely eliminate revenue sharing, but most fund companies offer institutional versions of their funds that will pay very little or no revenue sharing. While this means there's little or no revenue to offset plan fees, the plan fees can then be evenly and equally allocated among all of the plan's assets and participants. So quite often, your advisor will offer participant education as a part of their value-added service. Participant education is very important and can sometimes be the most effective way to ensure your participants have the information they need to make sound decisions regarding their retirement. However, all plan sponsors should be aware if your advisor is looking to use the plan or participant education as an entry point to prospect for supplemental services. This can include everything from private wealth management to outside products such as insurance and IRAs. Whether the participants need these products or not is actually irrelevant. The problem is that having your plan's advisor offer products and services outside the specific scope of the plan can be seen by participants as an endorsement by you as the plan sponsor. In other words, they're only buying these alternative services because they perceive that you as the plan sponsor view them as appropriate. If this individual is good enough to serve as the plan's investment advisor, then they're good enough for me on these other products. So if the other products turn out to be inappropriate, or if the participant is simply unhappy, it can put you as a plan sponsor at a disadvantage. The best ways to confirm the plan is not being used as an entry point for these other types of products and services is to review their Form ADV Part 2, now commonly referred to as the firm brochure. You can also request the advisor sign a non-solicitation agreement, which would prohibit these actions. And as always, the best cure is prevention. There's no substitute for supervision by you as the plan sponsor. Go to those participant meetings, talk to your advisor, ask your participants if they're being solicited for private wealth management or outside investments, and make sure that you have a handle on it as a plan sponsor. So we mentioned annual due diligence a few slides back when we discussed your responsibilities in the agreements. Now, these are a few of the things you want to be sure to request and have as documentation on an ongoing basis. Company financials will show the health and direction of your provider's business. You want to see what direction is their business, how much is derived specifically from the retirement industry, how much is derived from private wealth management, asset management, and all different sources of business. So you want to get those financials on an annual basis. Proof of insurance will provide reassurance that your advisor continues to carry insurance that is specifically applicable to ERISA. Be sure to review the proof of insurance and review the terms. It'll let you know how much liability coverage they have, how much liability they retain, and how costs are covered. As I discussed on the last slide, be sure to get the most current version of the firm's ADV Part 2 or firm brochure. This will update you on the company's practices, any changes, and any legal or regulatory infractions. All of these are important aspects of your annual due diligence. In fact, you can request from your advisor, I want the annual due diligence package, and you can request these specific items to be included there. So most providers commit to completing a plan review on at least an annual basis. These reviews should have core components that are universal across all plan sponsors and providers. Again, these reviews serve as supplement to specific meeting minutes and will document the review process and how decisions for improvement and change are reached. So you want to look through committee structure, investment discipline, plan administration. The investment discipline should include things like your investment policy statement, quarterly monitoring report, diagnostic tools, any of the different pieces. You want to review those, review them internally, make sure that you have them in your file so that, again, if you're ever challenged down the road, you have those different pieces you can pull out to prove the investment discipline. Plan administration, again, getting that annual review. You want to look at plan design. What are the participant metrics? Who's contributing? Which age groups? How much are they contributing? What's the retirement readiness programs that you may have in place? Make sure you have all these different pieces reviewed with your providers on an annual basis, and also do that internal review to make sure you have it in your files. That first one, committee structure, review your committee structure on an annual basis. Who sits on your internal investment committee? Do you have senior ranking people? Do you have an employee representative? Do you have folks that are senior ranking or otherwise that continue not to show up for the meetings? You want to make sure that you don't continuously document people as being on the investment committee but not actively participating, not coming to the meetings. You want to get those people actually off the investment committee and put in folks that can have the commitment to come to the meetings and participate. Participant communications, you want to make sure that you have any historical and future initiatives documented, have copies of those in your file. If you do that fee and service benchmarking, again, as an annual internal review, have that due diligence in your file of all of your plan vendors and review your documentation. What's the purpose of it? Do you have adequate documentation? Is it all in one place and is it organized? The easiest way to combat a challenge or an audit or litigation is to have a quick response and to have a file where you can easily go in, pull out the documents that are requested, and provide them to the folks that are requesting them. So much like the annual review, quarterly reviews can serve as a little bit of a more frequent check-in with the plan and your providers. Be sure to include a meeting agenda with attendance. Again, you want to say who is supposed to be at the meeting, who is on the committee, and who is actually there. Show what's the agenda in terms of what do you want to cover, and then anything that's unresolved business, assignments to various parties for follow-up, and any issues in need of further discussion. There are two distinct sides to these type of reviews. There's one for plan administration, and then there's one for your plan investments. Again, plan administration is the participation, contribution, any evolving challenges or solutions. And then the investments is the quarterly review for the watch list, any fund replacements, any concerns with the overall plan investment structure. The amount of time that you spend on each topic each quarter is really insignificant. It's not of any importance that you spend a certain amount of time on one or the other, but rather than documenting that each were reviewed, even if no action is necessary. So again, the amount of time on each is less important than spending time on items that actually require attention. So basic rules for minutes on this slide. When it comes down to it, there are several basic rules you'll want to follow to be sure when you're creating your plan minutes. Identify your challenges, but be sure to word them in a way that presents them as an opportunity for improvement. Simply saying that you have a big issue, it's disastrous, and you're trying to address it doesn't really do a lot for you as a plan sponsor, both in terms of risk mitigation and documentation. Word them in a way that's going to put them as an opportunity for improvement in participation or an improvement in communication. Whatever the issue might be, word it as a way to improve the plan and provide a higher benefit to your employees. As previously mentioned, be sure to assign specific tasks to your vendors to ensure there's accountability. No matter what the issue is, if it's a fund replacement, if it's a communications effort, if it's an issue where something was submitted late, no matter what it is, assign specific tasks to your vendors. That's why they're there. In connection with documenting the challenges, be sure to document actions that have been taken towards successes. Documenting completion of a task or resulting success is as important, if not more important, than documenting the issue in the first place. Reference your process. Process. Document it, reference it, and be concise. In many instances, less is more. You'll find that what is more important than anything is that you have a process, that you're following that process, and that you have it documented on an ongoing basis. And as a final word of caution, beware of rewording recommendations. It's important for all of your materials to match and for your minutes to match very specifically the tone and direction of your meetings. Even the smallest and seemingly innocent rewording can take on new meaning. Auditors are trained to look for these types of discrepancies and can call into question the authenticity of the entire process resulting from these types of issues. In other words, if your investment advisor recommends that you remove a fund for a certain reason, paraphrasing that down doesn't do you any good. It can put that risk and that responsibility back to you as a plan sponsor rather than for the individual that you've hired to actually make that recommendation to you. With that, I've covered a lot of information, I think, in a very short amount of time. I do want to thank everybody for coming today. I'll open it up to questions in just a second. As you go through all these different slides, I believe we'll provide this presentation to everybody later. There is a lot of, again, words on these slides that hopefully everybody can take back, look through your current agreements, look through your practice and how you have things documented, and really make a difference for your plan going forward.
Thank you so much, Brad. And if anyone else has any questions, they can go ahead and type them in the Q&A pane at the bottom of your screen. Brad, I did have one question that came through, and I wanted to share this one with you while we're waiting for any other questions, maybe. Earlier in the presentation, you talked about fee neutrality. Is that something that's becoming more common? How are sponsors or providers handling this?
So yes, it is becoming more common. And frankly, as we're out doing plan reviews with our existing clients or even coming to the UCS events, we've had a lot of folks that are trying to get more information about it. Frankly, it used to be years ago that we would talk to plan sponsors and they would say, gosh, we have these two funds that are subsidizing the cost of the entire plan. It really doesn't seem fair that they're subsidizing the folks that are in these lower cost funds that don't generate any revenue sharing. And the answer was there really wasn't a good answer. If you couldn't completely eliminate the revenue sharing through different share classes of existing funds, well then you were kind of stuck. But now, depending on the provider, a lot of providers have started finding the technology and the way to say we can actually take, if Brad was generating revenue from a fund, we can take the revenue that we get from the fund company and rebate it directly back to Brad. And it varies across different providers, but it's a great question to ask your current record-keeping provider on how can they handle it, how do they currently handle it, and what just are the options for you as a plan sponsor.
Okay, thank you. We do have another question that's come in. Are fees charged by the investment advisor, such as SWBC, paid directly by the plan sponsor or out of plan assets in addition to the custodian/record keeper fee?
So it'll vary depending on your investment advisor and the structure of your plan. So for example, there are fee-based investment advisors. SWBC is considered a fee-based investment advisor, meaning that we don't have any affiliation with the plan assets in terms of we're not the broker of record. We don't have the direct, again, connection to the plan investments. Our relationship is with the plan sponsor, and so that's what fee-based investment advisors are, where we would send an invoice directly to the plan sponsor and say, here's X dollars for this quarter's services, and it's up to the plan sponsor how they handle that, and they can pay it directly out of the company's coffers, directly from the company's assets. They could pay it from plan assets. It is considered a qualified plan expense, so you could charge it to the plan participants, or you could use the revenue sharing from the plan if your plan is set up that way, where if you get revenue sharing from the funds and it gets put into what's called an ERISA account, where you can use that money to then pay plan expenses. Again, an investment advisor would be a qualified fee, and you'd be able to pay it from the revenue sharing to, again, help offset the cost of an investment advisor. There's another way. Some investment advisors are commissioned, and they would be set up as either the broker of record or in some capacity associated with the plan, whereby they would get a direct feed of a portion of the plan assets. And that's becoming, I would say, less common, only because then there can be a perceived conflict to say, we want to put in a certain fund so that it generates a certain asset stream. We're going to put in one that generates 25 basis points in revenue just to make sure that we get the right fee, rather than just saying, no matter what, we don't really care what investments you use, we're going to get the same fee no matter what, so that it's a true no conflict of interest approach.
Okay, thank you so much, Brad. We really appreciate your time today, and as Brad mentioned, We will send the presentation out, and we will have the full recording posted on the University Conference Services website. So you'll be able to hear all of Brad's comments and see the slides all at once. And so hopefully you'll find that to be a great resource moving forward. Thank you, everyone. And please stay on just for another moment so that you can take our survey at the end. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.